Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy, and specifically to look at the latest data, which shows that the Russian economy is really struggling right now, and actually, the situation is getting worse. And to give you some real life examples, I thought I'd look at two of the most popular products that are purchased by Russian consumers: potatoes and gasoline. Now, potatoes are a staple diet in Russia. They're actually the 12th largest consumer of potatoes globally per kilo per year per capita. And unfortunately, from Russia's point of view, there are major problems in the potato market in Russia right now because the current harvest is one of the worst that Russia has had for a long period of time, and they're also struggling to bring in sufficient imports. And as a result of that, potato prices have risen dramatically over the last 12 months. You can see from this chart, I've plotted here two different prices: the wholesale price, which is shown by the orange line at the bottom, and then the retail price, so basically the price that you and I would be paying when we go to the store. And you can see that back in July 2022, so shortly after the war in Ukraine started, wholesale prices were sitting at around about 10 rubles per kilo and retail prices around 30 rubles. Now, over the last 3 years, you can see that there's been a significant increase. And by July 24, wholesale prices were up to 30 rubles and retail prices had actually gone up to 55 rubles. So this is one of the reasons why Russia has been experiencing high levels of inflation, because potatoes are one of the staple items that go into the basket of goods when you're calculating inflation. But if we look at the situation over the last 12 months, you can see that there are serious problems right now because wholesale prices have jumped up to $45 per kilo. Sorry, 45 rubles per kilo. $45 would be very expensive. But retail prices are now above 90. So over the last 12 months, there has been a 65% increase in the price of potatoes. And whilst that might not seem like a material issue for most people, potatoes are the staple diet. They are going into virtually every meal, particularly for the lower income families in Russia. So this is having a disproportionate impact on the poorer end of the Russian society. And this is a real life problem from Russia's point of view, because whilst we might be talking about inflation of 9 or 10%, and we'll go on to look at the inflation data in a moment, when you're talking about 65% increase in the one thing that you're eating every single day, that's going to hurt a lot of families in Russia. And that's a major problem. Now, before we go on any further today, I want to talk to you about NordVPN, who I've partnered with for today's video, and who are offering Joe Blogs viewers an exclusive 4 months extra on a 2-year plan. Unfortunately, cybercrime is becoming a more and more common occurrence. And it's not just you and I who are being targeted. It was recently reported that multinational telecommunications giant BT Group had to shut down some of its servers following a ransomware attack by a gang called Black Basta. So it's never been more important to protect yourself online. And NordVPN offers a feature called Threat Protection that blocks access to websites known to host malware, including ransomware. So NordVPN is fantastic for protecting you every time you go online to make sure that nobody's hacking your passwords and can't steal your identity or any money from you. But it's also fantastic for opening up a world of entertainment, because you can access movies and TV shows and sports events in areas that's not available to you normally. All you need to do is change your location and access all of that entertainment and information. And the fantastic news is that NordVPN is offering Joe Blogs viewers an exclusive 4 months extra on a 2-year plan, which you can access by going to nordvpn.com/Joe Blogs or clicking in the link in the description below. And the great news is that they're offering a 30-day money-back guarantee. And one of the other things that people spend a lot of their income on is gasoline. This is something that is must-have for a lot of people. You need to get in your vehicle and go places. And I wanted to have a look at what's been going on with gasoline prices, because we're seeing a really interesting trend in 2025. So this chart shows the movement in gasoline prices in Russia over the past 3 years. And To keep things simple, I've got the scale on the right hand side here showing in dollars, US dollars per litre. So that's not per gallon. So anyone watching in the States who's thinking, wow, Russian gasoline's really cheap, we'll go on to have a look at the comparison between the two countries in a moment. But what we can see here is that 3 years ago, gasoline prices were running at around about $1 per litre. But between the end of 2022 and the end of 2024, they came down steadily. And by the end of 2024, they were sitting at around about 50 cents per litre. But as you can see, over the last 6 months, we have seen a significant increase in gasoline prices, and they're now up to just around 80 cents per litre. And that's the highest that they've been in Russia since December 2022. So this is a really interesting dynamic because Russia's obviously one of the biggest producers of gasoline, one of the biggest exporters. It has a surplus. That's why it's selling millions of barrels of gasoline and oil to other countries every single day. But they've started hiking the price of gasoline in Russia itself. And if we have a look at this chart, it compares the price of gasoline in Russia, which is shown by the orange line at the bottom, and the price of gasoline in the USA, which is shown by the yellow line. And you can see that back in July 22, 3 years ago, there was a huge difference between the two countries. And what I've done for this chart is shown it in US dollars per gallon. So back in those days, we were looking at around about $5 per gallon in the USA. It was a very expensive time because of the big spike in oil prices that we saw following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But at that time, Russian consumers could buy a gallon of gasoline for less than $2.50. So it was less than half the price in Russia than it was in the USA. Now, as things started to stabilize and the price of oil globally came down, the price fell in the USA, but there was still a significant difference. And by July 23, the price of gasoline in Russia was up to around $2.70. And in the USA, it was sitting at about $3.70. So still a marked difference. But as you can see, over the last 2 years, the price of gasoline in the USA has continued coming down. And as we've just seen, the price of gasoline in Russia is now going up. And if we look at the differential today, it is a lot smaller than it was 3 years ago. So we're talking about a situation where, interestingly, gasoline prices are coming down for the USA and also most other countries in the world because oil prices have been coming down over the past 6 months or so. But we're seeing the retail price of gasoline in Russia going up. And once again, this is a problem for a lot of families and particularly lower income people in Russia because they're having to pay gasoline prices. They need to keep buying it so that they can get in their vehicle and go places and go to work and do all the things they need to do. And when you've got a marked increase, such as we've seen over the past 12 months, we've got an increase here of around about 20 or 25% in gasoline prices. And when you couple that with what's been happening with potato prices, you can see the real life problems that are going on in Russia right now. Now, if we have a look at this chart, it shows the latest data for inflation in Russia. And this chart shows what's been happening over the past 12 months. And you can see that inflation peaked in March of this year at 10.3%. And in the last 3 months, it's been coming down. So from a trend point of view, that looks quite positive. But when you look at the actual figures involved, the scale on the right-hand side of this chart starts at around about 8.5% and goes up to around about 11%. So we've got high levels of inflation at all points in the last 12 months. In fact, the lowest level of inflation that Russia has seen in the last 12 months was in October 24 at 8.5%. And the current rate of inflation of 9.4% is significantly more than the target level of 4% that's been set by the Bank of Russia. And that 4% level in itself is pretty much double what most other economies are going for. The USA have a target rate of 2%, as does the UK and Canada. So it's broadly speaking for developed countries around about 2%. Russia have pushed theirs on to 4%, but 9.4% is still significantly above that. And this is a problem because whilst inflation remains high, then the Bank of Russia will want to increase interest rates because that's what you do to try to tackle high levels of inflation. You push up interest rates, which then deters companies and individuals from borrowing money. Therefore, they have less to spend. Demand isn't as high, and therefore prices should start coming back down. So that's what the Bank of Russia will want to do. But that isn't what President Putin wants the Bank of Russia to do. He wants them to cut interest rates to boost the economy. Now, if we have a look at what's been happening over the past 3 years to inflation, you can see that it's been seriously high at all points in the last 3 years. There was a very brief period at the start of 2023 when we saw inflation dramatically falling, and we don't really have a very good explanation as to how that possibly happened. Because when you look at the rest of the trend here, everything is sitting at around 9 or 10%. And we had this really big dip all of a sudden out of the blue in 2023. But if we ignore that dip, inflation has been sitting at seriously high levels. And the problem with long-term high inflation is that it erodes the value of your money because you can buy less at the store and therefore you're spending everything that you're earning. You're not able to save anything. People feel less wealthy, and inflation breeds inflation because as prices go up, then people want to be paid more in terms of wages and costs go up. So companies want to increase their prices to keep their profit margins. And so it becomes a really vicious circle. And that's what's been happening in Russia for at least the last 3 years. Now, if we compare the current rate of inflation in Russia with the rest of the G20, the 20 largest economies in the world, you can see that there are only two countries that have a higher rate of inflation: Argentina, where it's currently over 43%, and Turkey, where it's over 35%. And then if you follow the channel, you'll know that we've discussed both of those countries at length. They're both having economic crises at the moment. They're both in a state of complete chaos. So I don't think they're very good benchmarks. Russia certainly won't want to be basing its economy on what's going on in Argentina or Turkey. And if we look down the rest of this list, you can see that only Brazil have a rate of inflation above 5%. Everybody else is less than 5%. And in fact, for the majority of countries, they're less than 3%. And right at the bottom, we've actually got some countries that are below 1%. So Russia is out of kilter with the rest of the G20. This isn't like the COVID-19 pandemic when we saw inflation spiking all across the world. Everybody was paying higher prices because there wasn't enough supply and there was lots of demand, and so prices soared. That isn't happening now. This is specific to what's happening in Russia, partly as a result of the sanctions, which have increased the price of all of their imports, and partly because Russia is struggling to produce enough of various things like potatoes to satisfy its internal demand. Now, in terms of what the Bank of Russia has been doing over the past 3 years, if you follow the channel, I'm sure you'll be aware that they've been increasing interest rates. So between the middle of 2023 and the end of 2024, interest rates rose from 7.5% to 21%, and 21% is extremely high. Now, despite the fact that inflation is still well above the target rate from the Bank of Russia's point of view, they've actually reduced interest rates to 20%, and it's very likely that at the next meeting at the end of July, they'll come down again. Might be 19%, could be even less than that, because President Putin and Sberbank, the biggest bank in Russia, have said that they want rates down to closer to 10%. So they want them halved from where they are now. But clearly the Bank of Russia isn't very keen on that, because that would then probably fuel higher inflation. And so you get this really vicious circle. But that's what's been happening with interest rates. And I thought it was worth comparing that to the rest of the G20. And as you can see, the only two countries with higher interest rates are Turkey, where they're at 46%, and Argentina at 29%. Brazil are the only other country in double figures of 15%. We've then got Mexico at 8%, South Africa 7.25%, India and Indonesia 5.5%, and then everybody else is 5% or less. So 20% is off the scale. This is completely out of kilter with the rest of the developed world. So that tells us in itself that there are serious problems in Russia right now. Anybody that believes that the Russian economy is doing really well just has to look at that interest rate to question whether or not that's true, because you don't have interest rates at 20% for an economy that is motoring, that's doing really well. It would be down at maybe 2% or 1.5% if the economy was really on fire. But what we're seeing is 20% is actually the emergency rate that the Bank of Russia introduced immediately after the war in Ukraine started. So the fact that it's now back up to 20% tells us that there is an emergency going on in Russia right now. And if we compare that rate of 20% against the rest of the world, every other country in the world, you can see that Russia is right up there. We've got countries like Venezuela, Turkey, Zimbabwe, Argentina, Ghana, Nigeria, Malawi above Russia. But Russia shouldn't really be in this category. If they're doing well, if the economy is performing, it certainly shouldn't be above countries like Angola, Gambia, Haiti, Liberia, and Kazakhstan. It should be well down this list. So I just wanted to show that, to highlight the serious problems going on in Russia right now. Now, one of the other problems that Russian businesses have is that they're not passing on all of their cost increases in terms of their prices. This chart shows the movement in producer prices, also called factory gate prices, so the price of goods once they're leaving Russian factories over the last 12 months. And you can see that 12 months ago, in June 24, producer prices were increasing by around 13%. So that was broadly in line with what was happening with inflation. So as prices were going up, Russian companies were able to benefit from that. And that was good for them because it meant that they could then pay higher wages and cover all of their increased costs and maintain their profit margins. But what we've seen over the last 12 months is that the rate of increase in producer prices has fallen dramatically, and they are now down to around 0.1%. So when you compare that to what's happening with inflation at 9.4% and things like gasoline and potatoes that are going up by 20 or 65%, Russian businesses are now not able to pass on the increase in their costs. They're not benefiting from this rising inflation, but they've still got rising costs in terms of increased labor costs because of the war economy, increased raw material costs, increased cost of energy, all of those sorts of things. So what this means is that Russian businesses are losing profit. Their profit margins are being taken away because they can't pass on price increases despite the fact that they've got big cost increases. So this is a big problem for Russian business. And if we look at what's been happening over the past 3 years, you can see that the current situation where we've got virtually no increase in producer prices is the worst that's been seen in Russia since the middle of 2023. And when you look at the trend as to what's been happening since the end of 2023, it's significantly downward. So producers, companies in Russia are not benefiting from these high rates of inflation, the prices going up. And what that tells us is that a lot of this is being driven by the imports. So it's not Russian businesses forcing up prices, it's imports that are going up. And that's interesting because the ruble has been strengthening. So you would have expected the price of imports to be going down. However, a lot of companies that Russia is dealing with overseas simply won't accept payment in rubles. So the fact that the ruble is stronger doesn't actually benefit Russian companies because nobody's accepting rubles in terms of a form of payment. Now, in terms of the other thing that we look at when we're talking about what's happening with companies, it's the Purchasing Managers Index. So this is a survey of all of the people who work in Russian companies who are purchasing raw materials and various things in advance of their production schedules. So it tells us whether or not these companies are expanding or contracting. And the key issue here is the 50-point mark. So if you have a score above 50, it means your company is expanding, you're buying more materials, you're gearing up for more sales. If it's below 50, then it means you're contracting. And what we can see here is a very clear trend over the last 12 months. In June 24, the PMI was coming in at almost 55%. So that was pretty high. That's a rapid expansion. But over the last 12 months, we've seen a serious slowdown. And if we look at this 50-point mark, you can see that in March, it was seriously below 50. It remained below 50 in April. There was a slight increase in May, where it came in broadly at 50, which means no growth. And then in June, we've seen it crashing back down to 47.5, which is the lowest level that's been seen in the past 12 months. And if we expand the scale of this chart to show the last 3 years, you can see that the current situation is the worst that Russian businesses have seen in the last 3 years. So basically, the situation is getting really serious. And when you look at the trend from 2024, from the middle of 2024 onwards, it's been seriously downward. So if that continues, it means that we will see lots more Russian businesses contracting. They basically won't be expanding, they'll be selling less. And combined with the fact that they can't pass on any of their price increases, this means serious trouble for Russian businesses, which in turn means serious trouble for the Russian economy, because if the businesses aren't selling things, if they're not making profit, they won't pay tax, therefore they won't contribute to the Russian economy, GDP will not grow. And so this tells us that there are serious problems in Russia right now. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because we've been following what's been happening in Russia, and I get lots of messages constantly from people saying, you're talking a lot of rubbish. The Russian economy is actually doing really well. It's doing better than most other economies. But what I wanted to show you today was the latest data, which does not show that Russia is doing well. In fact, it tells us that the Russian economy is potentially on the brink of some form of disaster, because what we are seeing is persistent high inflation. And that inflation is actually coming through in some categories really seriously. So we've seen things like potatoes and gasoline are rising at really fast rates. We've got a 20% increase in gasoline and a 65% increase in potato prices over the last 12 months. And they are staple items for most families in Russia. So that tells us there's a serious problem. But also across the board, we've got more than 9% inflation. And this has been persistently high for the past 3 years. And that erodes the value of your capital. So all of that tells us that there are serious issues. And the key metric is what's going on with interest rates. Interest rates currently are at 20%. That is off the scale compared to every other developed country in the world. And as we saw, Russia is right up there with countries like Argentina and Turkey, and it's actually in the top 15 in the world currently. That tells us that there are major problems. And the other thing that we've looked at today is that the companies in Russia are seriously struggling. They're not able to pass on any of their cost increases. They're seeing producer prices basically remaining flat right now. And that's a problem because it's going to wipe out all of their profit margins, push them potentially into loss-making situation. And the Purchasing Managers Index tells us that companies in Russia right now are contracting. There is no expansion, there is no growth, and that's bad news for the Russian economy and Russian GDP, because if companies aren't growing, then simply speaking, the Russian economy will be contracting and could be heading for a recession, because the wartime economy can't go on forever because Russia is running out of money in its national wealth fund. So the overall summary of today's video is that the latest data that we're seeing coming out of Russia tells us that Russia is in a very serious situation right now. It could be heading for a recession, and if the wartime economy comes to an end, if Russia stops funding all of those businesses, then that could mean a serious implosion in the Russian economy. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and thank you for everyone that supported me, either through YouTube Super Thanks, or Buy Me a Coffee, or Patreon, or YouTube membership, or Buy Me a Coffee membership. Thank you so much for your support, really helps to keep me going, and here's something to put a smile on your face.